Welcome to Crossings Conversations. I'm John Franklin, your host. Crossings refers to a visual art exhibition that will take place in Toronto from March the 2nd to April the 14th of 2022. It's part of a series of exhibitions that began in London in 2016 and that focus on the Stations of the Cross. The Toronto exhibit is initiated by Imago, a charitable arts organization active in Canada since 1972, and whose mandate is to work at the intersection of art and faith. These conversations invite the listener to capture the broader content and context of the exhibition. Our guests for this broadcast are Rosen and Catriona Laing, who have together generated the vision for these exhibitions. Before we begin our conversation, let me briefly introduce our two guests. Rosen is Professor of Religion and Visual Culture and the Director of the Henry Luce III Center for Arts and Religion at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Aaron holds a PhD from Cambridge University, and among his publications is a book titled Art and Religion in the 21st Century. Catriona Laing is chaplain of St. Martha and St. Mary's Anglican Church in Louvain, Belgium, and associate chaplain at the Anglican Pro-Cathedral of the Holy Trinity in Brussels. She earned her bachelor's and doctoral degrees at Cambridge University, and she has a particular interest in interfaith dialogue and has published a number of articles on related themes. Welcome to you both, and thank you for being with us. Given your bios, it seems that both of you have pretty busy lives or are involved in a number of things. Can you just tell us briefly what are some things that you're doing at present or that are upcoming in the near future in relation to the arts?
So I'm currently serving in an Anglican community in Belgium. So my day job is to be the chaplain to the Anglican Church in Leuven, and also to work in the cathedral, the Anglican Cathedral in Brussels, where I live. So my day job is parish ministry, and all that brings with it. My current sort of extra activities, if you like, are working quite a lot in the social justice area of social justice. So I'm very involved in some projects here in Brussels, working with the refugee community in Brussels, predominantly around food provision. In my chaplaincy job in Leuven, we're very involved in some racial justice work, and so we've been having a series of talks on racial justice. So I'm not actually directly involved in any other art projects apart from Stations of the Cross currently, but I think these two other things that I do feed into the motive that I bring to the work that I do with Aaron in the Stations of the Cross. But I'll let Aaron talk about the art.
All right. Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's very complimentary because I think everything I do is in some ways involving the arts, and then the sort of percentage is exactly the correlative to Catriona's, in the sense that then I do work in social justice, but I bring that into the arts. So we just suffuse things in different directions, I'm director of the Henry Luce III Center for the Arts and Religion at Wesley Theological Seminary. And as part of our center, we have a gallery, we have a studio space for artists, back when people went places and did things. And although we'll be soon to revive that and
hopefully
go back to re-outfitting that, and we're building some pottery facilities and things like that are exciting. And we also have a permanent collection that I manage. So we do a lot of acquiring works by emerging diverse artists. So that's another big sort of point of emphasis. And then we do research and as a group, and me particular, into the arts. And so everything has sort of different angles that related to the arts, but social justice is, and the a sense of responsibility to support diverse artists is definitely at the core of our mission.
Well, you were both involved either at the very beginning or in the early stages of art stations. And those who will be listening in on this will not know that story well. And actually, I don't know that story really well. So I wonder if between you could tell us a little bit of that story. I think, Aaron, you were involved right at the beginning. And Catriona, did you come in very soon after the beginning? I've forgotten, but
yeah,
go ahead.
Why don't you kick off, Aaron, and talk about London? Because that was Aaron's baby.
Yeah, London in 2016, one of the things we talked about, John, is whether there was an intent for this to be a multi-year project, and decidedly not. And as you know, and as Catriona knows, it's usually when you do something big, you think, great, now the really exciting part is that it's over. And so it definitely would not have continued if it wasn't for Catriona's excitement, seeing it in London, and the excitement of bringing it to DC. But the ambition in DC sort of continued on that from what I wanted to explore in London, at the time, which was building on a book that I was working on with Ben Quash and Chloe Redaway called Visualizing a Sacred City, that looked at the art and religion in London across different periods. And I was also teaching a course in London at KCL, King's College London, that was about the lives of London. I used to always joke that I was less educated than the average London taxi driver to teach the course. So I felt the sense that I really needed to keep exploring in those early years all these different religious sites around the city and really dig into places. And so, and as I got more into that, then I just kept stumbling across places and thinking, this is a great place to show art. I'm surprised with all of the London art venues that people aren't utilizing these spaces and doing these kinds of things there. And I also saw it from the churches that they really wanted to draw in more people, but they were sort of running up against it. To use a kind of anecdote from the series Rev, you can only turn so many churches into smoothie bars, and cafes. You need to have some other things that you're offering to get people in the door. And so there was an appetite for showing art, but in many cases not a real expertise or connections with sufficiently interesting artists to draw people in that way. And so I've always been interested in that kind of matchmaking process of artists who want to explore new spaces and churches who want to get new audiences.
That's great. That's great. So, Catriona, it seems that you were, in part at least, the catalyst to have multi-versions of this art stations. Can you say something about how you got involved?
Yeah, absolutely. I saw the exhibition in London, as Aaron said, and I was serving in an Episcopal church in Washington, DC at the time, living there with my family. And I was just struck. I loved the exhibition, and then I was struck by what a great city Washington, DC would be to have a similar project. And so Aaron and I go back a long way. We were students, undergraduates together at university. So I contacted Aaron and said, any interest in another year of Stations of the Cross? I think like Aaron and like most of these kinds of projects, I didn't have in mind that then it would be another year and another year and another year. I think it's been a wonderfully organic development in that sense. And with each iteration, each city, there's been a different energy, but new people have seen it and come on board just in the way that I did. You being an obvious example.
Yes.
So there's a kind of natural growth that has happened. It was never, planned that way. New York was an obvious follow-on from Washington DC because of the funding that we had for Washington DC was connected to a commitment to then do it in New York the following year. So that was one that we knew was coming.
Yeah.
Amsterdam. I was just going to ask, how did that one emerge?
Well, the funny thing is that I'm a real tremendous fan of the Low Countries, and almost revoltingly uncritical. I think everything is great about Belgium and the Netherlands, which always surprises anyone who's actually from there, where they're sort of deficient in strident nationalism. Again, something I find pretty attractive as an American. And so I took my sabbatical at University College Utrecht, and and I was making a lot more connections with my research with Dutch academics, curators, and different things. And I think it's really through that, and eventually got connected with Marlene Hengelaar Rookmaker, of artway.eu, and really then she brought on Annika Uenveel.
Yes.
And really, I loved the idea of this kind of momentum. And Catriona and I both thought, actually a sign of a success of a cultural project is not necessarily keeping tight ownership over something, but actually that you want to see it replicated. There's no profit to this. The whole profit is that
That's
more
right.
people get to experience this idea, and that it gets tested out and refined in different ways. And I think that's also been really nice to see different places put a greater stamp and emphasis on narratives that are local, and a sense of the geography of the place that they're based in, because one of the things we're interested in is how do you find and identify the sacred, either through recovering traditional stories and rituals, or through making them up in urban spaces. And so it's just really fun to see other people take that and experiment with it, and then collect that as a kind of trove of data. And that's where I see the project heading, looking 10 years down the line, is that, the more we're able to collect these cities that have tried the project out, the more it will be replicable, and there'll be a sort of shared sense of expertise that people can draw on.
Yeah, it's great. And if I may, for those listening, just add in the little piece for Toronto. I was at a conference, was it in San Diego, I think, or was it maybe Denver? I can't remember.
Diego.
And I attended a session, then Aaron was on the panel. And you made a passing remark about Stations of the Cross in New York, which I had heard about. So I spoke with you after and asked you the question, so what about Toronto as a possibility? And your enthusiasm was just evident. So, and the rest is history, as we say.
For a cynic, I'm oddly very enthusiastic about things.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. So,
and San Diego is one of the last big trips I took. I mean, it's funny. It's like the end. So it's so there's an interesting kind of arc there to me, to think it's like one of the last times actually.
Well, that was in 2018. That was it was November 2018, and so we worked very hard on this in 2019, and then of course everything got slowed down. But what's been the feedback on the exhibitions? You haven't been involved directly in all of them, but either of you, what are you hearing? What kind of responses are you getting?
I mean, I think we did quite a lot of kind of metric stuff, looking at website use and podcast use and app use at the beginning. And to be honest, to me, that was only semi-helpful. I actually can't even remember what the figures were. They were pretty good. In New York, we were collaborating with Trinity Wall Street, and they were happy with the reception in terms of those sorts of numbers. But I think what's been more interesting to me is two different kinds of response or feedback on the church side. One is at the parish level. There was some really positive comments and feedback from parishes in New York. I'm particularly remembering New York because I have to say I was definitely less involved with Amsterdam and Deventer, who had used the exhibition during Lent as part of their Lent course, and they'd sort of matched it with both taking the route through the city and then coming back together as a parish and having sort of study sessions in church as well. So I think there are parish groups like that who have used it and who commented very positively on our Facebook page about their experience of walking the stations through their own city. Clergy, I think it's fair to say, are always looking for new ideas in these seasons that come around every year, and are always grateful for something that looks at a season in a different way or through fresh eyes. So I've had very positive feedback from clergy, both in America and in the UK. And actually this year, obviously, because we've gone online, that has massively widened. The dioceses in Europe where I serve now have been really positive about it, and have put a lot on their website about it, and the Suffragan Bishop David Hamid, has been incredibly supportive and keen for clergy to use this as part of their Lenten formation with their chaplaincies. So yeah, I think it's really appealed at the parish level.
And I think that's what's really nice, actually, is that we think of audiences for things. The way to actually organically increase audiences is small groups of committed people who then tell people about things and share about things and have structures for looking for meaning and talking about it and giving it an afterlife in a way. I mean, you think about how disaggregated the models are often for art viewers. That you have a big blockbuster show and then you track a bunch of people coming, but it's not actually all that interesting demographically usually. You're getting a lot of the same types of people, and the motivation is sometimes, oh, this is the only time to see this Leonardo here, or this is, I'm excited about this theme of a show, but it's often, I want to tell people I've been, right?
Right.
And there's something nice about having different types of audiences, even if they're not as primarily art driven. It's actually much more gratifying to see communities. And, and I've looked at some of the research around communities going to exhibitions, and there's some great material out there about the Hajj exhibition at the British Museum, and the massive leap forward they took in terms of engaging with British people and people visiting, but especially Muslims, and especially people from Bangladesh, Pakistan in particular. But they noticed some great demographic shifts that are really exciting. People just who hadn't been to the British Museum very much and didn't feel that it really represented them. In many cases, it represented things that the British Museum colonially spirited away from their communities.
Yeah, right.
But it didn't represent them today, and so it was a really proud moment for a lot of people to see that work. And there was a lot of good intercultural and interreligious dialogue that came out of that show.
Great.
And so I look at things like that at a really large scale as very inspiring. And I like to think at a small scale, we're kind of aiming at some of these, interesting connections and bringing different people to the arts and different people to different types of spaces. So that's what kind of interests us. In terms of Amsterdam, we're really fortunate that Dr. Lika Vinia, who's a curator at Catriona Convent, had a fellowship at the time and some scholarly funding to produce research based on ethnographic interviews with people who saw the show. And so then, as I was asked to write a piece recently about stations, I could draw on her data. And she's actually a much better social scientist, much better trained than I am in this kind of thing of really talking to actual people. And so it was very enlightening to read some of the narratives and some of the quotes of what people liked. And they liked really coming across unexpected spaces. They liked the collision of sacred and secular, having to go into a space that's been sort of taken over by tourists in the red light district, but then go to look for a moment of stillness and contemplation within that to see one of the stations.
Well, my next question is about this relationship between, what shall we say, sacred and secular. The series is clearly a case of exhibiting faith through the arts at some level. And it's also carrying out that task in many cases in a public setting. So this could be seen as a gesture of going against the grain of a secular urban culture. I mean, it's not always well received if you put something religious out there. However, the artwork done for these exhibits, the way you have described it and conceived it, and I think encouraged it to carry on, is to take art that bridges the gap between personal religious devotion and concerns for social justice. So would you comment on your vision to bring these two realities together in these art stations? I mean, I know that's a big question, but if you can each make a comment about that.
I think what I want to start by saying is that I think that sometimes we get too concerned with this divide between the sacred and the secular, or
Good.
the religious and the secular. And the gift of art is to blur that boundary. Art is a means for people like me, whose life is devoted to sharing my faith and supporting those who are on a similar religious journey to me. It's a wonderful means for someone like me to engage with people who think differently. One of the things we put on a lot of our website stuff and our publicity about Stations of the Cross is that we're not trying to come up with any answers. One of the beauties of this practice, this devotion of walking the Stations of the Cross, is that they leave us open to questions rather than trying to come up with any neat solutions. And so I've never felt in any way embarrassed or awkward about sharing this, because it's not a form of evangelism where you're saying, okay, tell you what truth is, or let me sew up the Christian faith in kind of 10 neat, easy answers. On the contrary, it's just offering something for people to engage with in the way that feels right to them. And I think that's partly because Aaron and I come from different religious traditions ourselves, but also because of the power of art to allow you to just offer something, to allow you to put questions and not feel that you have to, that there's one way of looking at this piece of art, or there's one way of interpreting this passage of scripture.
Yeah.
So it's really thanks to the art that I think you can blur these sacred and secular boundaries that are often far too rigid and meaningless. I mean, you know, I believe that God is in everything. I don't believe that God is restricted to our religious spaces or to the moments when we step inside a church building.
Oh, I think that's great. It's so the exhibitions are exploratory, which is great. I mean, that's what we're called to do, to explore, not to sort of be definitive about things, which is what you're saying.
Absolutely. And, you know, even the physical experience of walking around a city gives it that exploratory feel.
That's great.
You're discovering your city in a new way. You're seeing familiar things through different eyes. You're hearing someone else's take on something that you've walked past every day on your way to work. So there's definitely this sense of discovery and exploration, which for me is what the Christian faith is constantly asking us to do.
That's great. Aaron.
Yeah, I think that's extremely well said. I think that very few religions set themselves up to want to be boundarized within a small niche that they call the sacred, right? Religions are compelling because they offer and remain compelling even centuries later, because they offer a particular lens and way of engaging with the wider world. And even when we try to think of the narrowest examples and we try to think of monastic life, some of the great cultural contributions have been, and contributions indeed to social justice, are by those who live partly or mostly cloistered lives. And so even when we try to come up with the most extreme examples of the sacred or extreme secular instances, then we still find there's this tremendous permeability, and the categories themselves begin to disintegrate or to blur, as Catriona said, in really interesting ways. And so I think I would add to that not only do we want to sort of blur the sacred and secular, but also see that art is socially engaged, not only when it says and announces, I'm socially engaged, I'm doing social justice, but because producing art is about being a sensitive human and offering something back to others. And I think we oftentimes forget that, because we feel that we're either abdicating space to the art world to tell us what is art, or to museums or galleries to create sort of rarefied visions of that, or we let artists games and things that they say, and sometimes they're really accurate and really trenchant, and sometimes they're things that artists have learned to say to protect the value of their art or to protect its ability to say multiple things. But we forget that art can be socially sensitive and morally instructive in so many different ways.
It can,
if we bring those questions to art, and if it's good art. I still am a believer in good art. I think that it's not and I'm not interested in things that I think are propagandistic or are really set out primarily for evangelistic purposes. I think I'm always looking for multivalency in art.
Well, one of the things about art, and you both know this well, is that it first addresses our humanity, not particularly our religious identity, but it speaks to our humanity. And then from there, you can go into your context or your religious identity or whatever. But to hook in the humanity is really, I think, what art has a great power to do.
You can dislocate works of art, right? I mean, I think that's so one of the things we're doing is locating them and placing in a new context. You can also dislocate things. And I think the more we sort of adjust those with a kind of, a playfulness or a kind of almost, creative empiricism, as we put things in unexpected contexts, then it allows them to speak at those different registers. And I think that's what's also demands, I think, with the Stations Project, a kind of open-mindedness from the artists, and that's been really cool to see. I think is how artists sort of embrace that and like to be seen differently, because they're actually a little bit tired, I think, of being seen only by particular people in particular ways.
No, that's very good. My next question is related to what we've just been talking about. There are many who see a tension between the call to contemplation and the call to action. As you've rightly pointed out, that some people who were sequestered away in monasteries were some of the people who were also out there doing good things in the world. But this for many is a tension. And one of the challenges is, if you want to tell the story, the biblical narrative on the one hand, and then you also want to raise questions, good and appropriate and important questions about the social justice issues, the risk of one getting lost in the other. It could go either way. I mean, the social justice gets lost in the devotion, or the devotion gets lost in the social justice. Can you comment on that? And the question is, how does one sort of work that through so that as much as possible, you can generate, what shall I say, nurture of both sides? There was not both sides. I think they do really come together, but the contemplative and the social justice activist side.
I'll take it from the curatorial side, which is that I think the most important thing, and we actually talked about this in an event the other day, is that what does it mean to bring the arts into church environments, and how do you ensure that the works really speak to people and express or invite contemplation in the ways that you hope they might, that are very inclusive and focused on justice. And I think the first thing to do is to really respect artists and to give them the space to have open inquiry. So I'm in favor as a curator of doing things that are both very tightly focused and very open-ended at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really helpful to set really clear guidelines for people in terms of, here's the space. You cannot touch this. You can touch this. Like, it can be this big. You can't use this though, and to be really clear about that, because I think, like conceiving good poetry, et cetera, I think that, there can be real creativity within parameters that are set. But at the same time, you need to give people the openness to say, but we trust you, especially if we build a relationship between you and the space and the community that uses it. We trust you then to engage that sensitively and show us something new that we haven't predetermined. Yeah. So I think that's important. And also to really to start by asking yourself, what kind of voices are not being heard? So I think, there can be a tendency to leap too quickly into saying, I want this artist to talk about this, or I think they should talk about this thing. But the most important thing is to pick the right person who is sensitive and engaged and offers personal experiences and insights, life experiences generally, that they can draw upon to create fresh work for a space. And I think that's great. That's why, when we talk about diversity, the big thing is giving people opportunities and magnifying those voices and giving them the resources they need to tell those stories, rather than predetermining for them what story you think they should tell, which would be particularly relevant. Because that, if you get too didactic too early, then I think that can hinder the process.
No, I think that's great. Catriona.
Yeah, and I just want to, before I answer that, say that one of Aaron's great gifts to this project is the way he brings artists into it, like the range of people that he finds, and the way he inspires them is just wonderful. But to your question about devotion and social justice, this chaplaincy where I serve in Leuven is actually dedicated to St. Martha and St. Mary. So I've been thinking a lot about Martha and Mary
Yes,
recently,
and okay,
and how these two fit together. And actually inspired by an event we did this week, I was looking today at the visual commentary on Scripture and a Vermeer painting of Christ with Martha and Mary. And in this Vermeer painting, they're both there with Jesus, and Martha's holding the bread, and Mary's at his feet. But there's a tenderness in Jesus's eyes as he looks at Martha, and his hand is extended out towards Mary. And what this has really articulated for me, and I think is what you were really getting at, John, is the sense in which obviously it's a both and. And if you want to look at it in a binary way, then some of us will probably walk the Stations of the Cross, visit these exhibitions, and find ourselves more drawn to the devotional because we're a Mary. And others of us will find ourselves inspired by the social justice aspect because we're a Martha. To me, that's okay. I mean, the whole point is to provoke the passions, as we say, to let this exhibition speak to people in the way that it speaks to them. And, if you're at a stage in your life where what you really need is a Lenten experience that encourages you in your devotional life, you'll probably end up really picking out, getting from that aspect of the exhibition. If you're at a different stage, you'll be very inspired by the social justice, by the diversity of artists, by the issues that they raise, and ideally use that experience to go on and do something.
That's great.
So I think it's a healthy tension, and I think it's a very creative one.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's so interesting because I was just
sure.
This talk the other day looking at the Heschel's God in Search of Man, and it really brings out this Martha Mary dimension actually but just using different theological tools coming from Judaism of what is the relationship between the Sabbath and the other days, and so it is one of the questions he asked sort of towards the end of the book, and a major theme for Heschel is to think about how Judaism sanctifies time and sort of preserves it in a way, right? That it create and time even more than space. But one of the things he talks about is that you can't have the Sabbath just in exile among the other days. The Sabbath also has to come back and infuse its sacredness into the other days. Yeah. So it's both a process of keeping two things separate and that we still have Shabbat, and we end it with Havdalah, the act of separation, knowing that we're going back into but the last thing you do in Havdalah is you have the spices, and actually we have to fill it with bunny grams for Arthur to keep him interested, but you smell the spices in the spice box, and then it reminds you of the sweetness of Shabbat as you continue into the rest of the week. That's great. And I think and similarly to this Mary Martha dimension, it's how do we bring one to the other, and how do we keep these in this kind of sort of pneumatic kind of relationship where they continue to remain in dialogue with one another.
Both of you, very helpful responses. I mean, I'm wrestling with that a little bit in terms of the Crossings exhibit. How do we do that? How do we keep that dynamic alive and not lose one because of the other, and so on? But let me shift here as our time is slipping by. You both have an interest in interfaith engagements. So in what ways do you see art stations providing a context for interfaith conversations? And I'm sure you have lots to say about that, but Catriona, why don't you go first on this one?
Sure. Well, I think one of the big surprises for me when I first saw the exhibition in 2016 and began to think about bringing it to Washington, D.C. was the strong sense I got of actually what a gift the tradition, the practice of the Stations of the Cross was to the world. Forget art for a minute, just the Stations of the Cross. That the issues raised by the stations are issues to which we can all relate.
Yeah.
You know, Jesus was homeless. Jesus was a refugee. Jesus was unfairly condemned to death. Jesus was tortured. The list goes on. Jesus fell down again and again and again. These are not, restricted to a Christian experience of God in any way. So I was really blown away by the stations being something, to my surprise, that I thought could really speak to people of all faiths and none. My own academic interests are in Muslim, Christian, Jewish dialogue, particularly. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed in that experience, which has mostly been around text. So most of my interfaith work has been reading sacred texts with Muslims, Jews, and Christians together, called scriptural reasoning. But what scriptural reasoning taught me, and I now see happening also with the Stations of the Cross exhibition, is that my engagement with a Muslim or Jewish brother or sister as we study scripture together encourages me as a Christian to go deeper into my own faith tradition.
Yeah.
So I read the Gospel of John with a Jewish and a Muslim friend, and the questions that they ask, the way that they hear the passage, raises new questions for me and helps me see that passage through fresh eyes. I'll also learn a lot about the Muslim faith and the Jewish faith from the texts that they've brought. But ultimately, at the end of the day, for me, the most enriching kind of interfaith work is when I'm sent home wanting to explore my own Christian scriptures more deeply. And that's definitely the experience for me of scriptural reasoning. I'm fascinated by what I hear from the Quranic text and the Hebrew Bible. But usually when I get home, it'll be the Christian text that I go back to and think, that was really interesting, what Miriam asked me about that passage from John's Gospel. And I think the same is true for the Stations of the Cross, that having a Muslim artist come and put together a piece of work, like in New York, we had in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, Dua Abbas, opened up a whole new way for me of looking at that station. She brought in a painting that had women mourning, Muslim Shia mourning rites. It's a beautiful picture. You can see it on the station's website, and it's forever influenced the way that I will pray that station when I pray the stations. It hasn't stopped me praying that station. It's shown me a new way of doing it. Same for the Israeli artist Lenny Dotan, who's done several years in different places for us. She lives in Jerusalem, or she sometimes lives in Jerusalem, and has really taken us on a journey along the Via Dolorosa as a Jewish woman in Jerusalem. That is the best kind of interfaith dialogue for me.
That's great. Aaron, do you want to respond to that briefly?
Yeah, I think it chimes with me in different ways. And of course, being Jewish, being married to an Episcopal priest, working closely with Catriona on this project, and also now teaching at a seminary and a Methodist seminary. I feel that I somehow going deeper and deeper into Christendom, but that suits my particularly funky approach to life anyways, is that I think I was asked by a friend who was sitting in our backyard today about what I did my PhD on. Of course, like most scholars, I can barely remember, but but really what I set out to do in that first project was look at how modern Jewish artists look at the art of the Christian past. And I was really, there's so many times in my life when people sent me photos of, Lithuanian rabbis and asked me to identify them. And I've always said, they look fairly similar. There's very beardy, right? But there's a reason I didn't go looking for that type of art. There's some really great scholars who do, but I'm interested in finding Jewishness in unexpected places. And I think that sort of resonates with Catriona's experience that she talked about there, is that I find in creative tension and unexpected locations, that's where my Jewishness sort of becomes more redolent, more exciting for me. I see it more clearly. And I found myself teaching a seminary, being more interested. How do I want to mark time? And some of it almost a little competitiveness there of what I want to go looking for in my own tradition. And how much more knowledgeable I want to be. And I think that's right, as Catriona said, that we can't. There's an altruistic dimension, but if it's all just this idea of a kind of relativist paradise or something, that's not ultimately super attractive or super sustainable. And so one of the things that continues to interest me about the Stations of the Cross is to go deeper and deeper into that Christian tradition. And then also to ask productively how I find Jewishness there, or how I find it as a point of tension to extrapolate upon more. And Catriona gave the example of Dua Boston, and this year we have her husband Jahanzeb Haruna as well. And I love talking with both of them, become good friends through this project. And it's one of the things I really like about working with artists is I really have this kind of old-fashioned idea that a curator should be friends with them and think about their whole lives and sort of, insinuate themselves into people's personal lives, whatever. But that I really, I've loved getting to experience more about my Jewishness through watching them as Muslims, one is Shia and one is Sunni, tackle Christian motifs, and actually watching someone else do the same thing that I've been doing then gives me another layer to try to reflect on. And so I love this kind of Rubik's Cube element of just kind of continuing to reformulate things and taking set pieces, set traditions like the Stations, but keep asking, how is it that we move them in different directions, and what kind of patterns and things can we create that are these very dynamic tessellations. And so that's what kind of keeps me motivated as a curator and a scholar looking at interfaith dialogue in the arts.
It's wonderful to hear your answers from both of you, and how art and this interfaith conversation can be opened up wonderfully through the arts. I think that's great. Briefly on this question, we have, of course, around the world faced this pandemic, and it's impacted Crossings, the Toronto version of Art Stations, in terms of what we're going to do and what we've been able to do. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about how the realities of COVID can or will provide a context of relevance for the exhibition. I mean, how do you we can't tell entirely, but I think it would be just interesting to hear your reflections on that. So we've all been in a kind of forced sabbatical. That's probably not a good use of that term sabbatical, but we've all been sort of set aside for a little bit. And now things may be changing, but what does Art Stations have to say to that reality?
Well, I think in the art world, I think we're beginning to see people have taken the digital side as far as it can go, I believe, right now, given the current technological horizons. Within our lifetimes, of course, we're going to see augmented reality shows, which are much bolder than what augmented reality looks like now, holding up your phone and having something appear, or even tech responsive things where you're in a space and the images move or respond right. Some of these things are going to get really exciting and, frankly, as a humanist, to me, terrifying. But there's going to be a lot of new technological horizons. But right now, I feel that what we don't want to do is we've explored in Stations this year, I think, one of the really productive things, drawing people from different parts of the world together, doing what we're doing now as being a bunch of different time zones and talking about things from different locations. That's really exciting. But I don't think you can keep repeating that formula. And what really excites me about Toronto is it's back to the earth. You guys are going back to doing things, but also recognizing that there's going to be limitations and we have to adapt around health. And I think the key thing is always to adapt to the reality on the ground and then say, what if I pretend that this is not just frustrating, but it's exciting? I always like talking to architects because they just see things as design challenges.
Yeah, right.
And I actually like to think of religious tradition like that too, often with liturgy. No, it's a design challenge. So now you can't all sip from the same cup because that's a really bad recipe for spreading disease, right? So how are you going to fit your thinking about this in a different way? How are you going to deliver some of the same sort of spiritual nourishment in different ways? And I think, you're exploring the idea of going outside. I think that's great, is to think more and more about outside spaces that are interconnected, ecological art. And it's a great thing because Canada, I think, is more advanced than the US, although we all have a really far way to go in terms of respecting the traditions and peoplehood of First Nations. And I think it's really, there's an opportunity there to think about wisdom and experiences of First Nation peoples and responses to the environment, and thinking about an ecologically driven, environmentally sensitive, open exhibition outside largely.
Yeah.
So I think there's ways to bring these things into creative dialogue. And so my sort of like minor bit of humble advice is just to keep thinking of it as something that's creatively exciting rather than limiting. And I think it will be.
No, I think we very much feel that it's going public in this way, having to be outdoors, is great. Catriona, do you have any comment on that in terms of the COVID reality?
It's been an interesting year, but getting back to the city will be a good thing, and of course it will be different. I think there's this kind of weird experience going on at the moment where people are still kind of craving February 2020, and the reality is things have changed. Things won't stay the way they are, but they won't go back to February 2020. And so, like everything else, stations will look a bit different. But as Aaron says, that's exciting.
It is.
And people aren't going to leave cities. It's like Jerry Seinfeld responding to some millennial moron who had been posting some essay, I use the term loosely, on LinkedIn, that great literary source, about how they were going to leave New York and New York was dead. The cities as creative, dynamic environments which bring different people into proximity with one another aren't dead. They just are going to be experiences that are lived in different ways. And that doesn't have to mean a total fragmentation of a sense of community. It just means that our senses of proximity and physicality and things like that have to be more adaptive. But that's also something that we forget, that religion has been really good at in different ways.
It has.
There's periods when religion feels quite sludgy and quite glacial in its ability to change. But it shouldn't just collapse into taking that for granted. I mean, again, to come back to Heschel, because he's in my mind, one of the first paragraphs in God in Search of Man, he just says, religion isn't failing because of secularism. Religion's got its own problems. It needs to look at itself and ask what it could do better. And one of the things it can do better is engage in other resources that show people how urgently needed and humane and exciting and creative it can be.
We're out of time and maybe even a little over. Catriona, I wanted to ask you briefly, though. You have expressed your sense that these exhibitions are important for those who are training in seminary. And I'd like you just to comment very briefly on that.
I think it's more that I just think seminaries are a great context for people are thinking about what they're going to do in ministry when they're at seminary, and they've got time in a way that they have less of once they're in ministry, and they're open to suggestions. And so certainly in DC and in New York, our experience was that it was ordinand seminarians who got very excited about the stations, who offered to take groups around as part of, to do guided tours of the stations, who looked at ways of using the stations in liturgy during Lent. I think seminaries are very creative places. And so it's an opportunity for both ways. It's an opportunity for the Stations Project to work with seminarians to think about doing it differently, doing it in new ways, things that they think would be helpful. Aaron and I are both really interested in theological formation. How do we equip our theological leaders, if you like, to form the people that they influence and minister to. And seminaries are one of the obvious places to do some of that thinking with us.
Yeah.
And it's the only time to catch them in
Right.
some ways, as Catriona said, like this is when they're most fungible, to use a tech term these days, and I think and people recall that time really, really fondly, and the kind of connections they make. And also, as we're thinking about the future of seminary education, it's also helpful if we want seminaries to exist and we think that they do certain things really well. We have to remind ourselves why you can't just do it all online. And I think there's, and the arts are a really good case to say certain things happen when you're physically engaged with things, or when you're in a space singing or directing or doing different things. And so, or if people are going to do large, more distance models, but then come together periodically, then that time needs to be really well spent, and they need to do things that really imprint on them, and things that they that will truly form them in really kind of palpable ways. And the arts can do that better than a lot of other, sometimes better than their scripture classes, for better or worse.
It's true. It's true. I'm not sure whether you know this or not, but one of the colleges has asked me to create a course for January of 2022 that will sort of coincide or work alongside of the Crossings exhibit. So that's ready to go, and we'll be drawing many from the Toronto School of Theology community, and there are 7 colleges there, and we'll be drawing faculty from there to do the lectures, and of course having a field trip for the stations. Well, listen, let me just give you each a minute for a final comment. I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to chat with you, but please go ahead. If you have any final comment that you want to encourage people, or...
I think I just want to say that I'm so happy it's happening in Toronto. And it feels like this, I know you feel like it's been a bit stop-start.
Yeah,
but it feels very start to me now. It feels like there's a wonderful momentum, and it's a great city to be doing it in. And it feels like, in a way, this delay has given time for the project to develop a bit and to grow.
Right. I think what Catriona said is really great there, is that, this is the pandemic has meant a lot of shifts and stopping and starting. But as she said, it's really, it feels to us looking at it like all start, and that there's so much momentum and excitement and so much planning and thought that's gone into involving different institutions, and the excitement of being able to activate communities like the School of Theology, and to get different groups in the area excited and build them into the fabric of planning it and having that lead time. So it's really exciting. And Toronto is just such an incredible city. I still have such a strong memory of it from visiting, even as an adolescent, undoubtedly for some endocrinology conference for my dad, I'm sure. And I love that it's so multicultural. It has the film background, but it's also, even in the multiculturalism, I find so many parts of it that are really intriguing, and there seems to be endless sort of stories to extricate and to examine and think about. I think about all the Holocaust survivors that settle in that area, for instance. I mean, there's a lot of a richness of human experience in cities, and I think that's also as we're in a period when we're really it's become popular to talk about the greatness of all moving out to the suburbs. It's pretty important to remember that cities do special things, and that there's a creative and spiritual dynamism that comes from bringing people together in proximity.
Yes,
and I think Toronto does it as well as, or better than most cities I've ever been to.
That's great. Well, again, I want to thank you both for taking the time. It's been both inspiring and insightful to be in conversation with you. So I'm very grateful to you.